Welcome to Orbit into Sleep. Tonight we're heading somewhere truly special. We're going to the moon. This is relaxing Apollo program facts to fall asleep to, and there are no mid-roll ads to disturb you. Just gentle words and soft music to carry you through the night. So get yourself comfortable, pull the covers up, let your pillow take the full weight of your head, and just settle in. There's nothing you need to do right now, nowhere to be. Tonight is yours. We're going to spend some time together learning about one of the most extraordinary things human beings have ever done. The Apollo missions took people from the surface of the Earth all the way to the moon and back again. And there are so many wonderful little details tucked inside that story. Things that are fascinating, but also, I think, quite soothing to hear about. The science, the people, the quiet moments of bravery. We'll wander through all of it at a gentle pace. Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep with us, it would mean so much if you could tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really does help other people who are struggling to sleep find us, and we would love to have them here too. Also, we're curious. Let us know in the comments roughly how many hours of sleep you normally get each night. We love reading those. Now then, let your eyes close whenever they're ready. You don't have to try to sleep, just listen and let your mind drift wherever it wants to go. We'll take it from here. A dream that started on the ground. You know, every great journey begins with a single moment, a decision, a deep breath before the first step. And for the Apollo program, that moment came on a warm day in May 1961, when President John F. Kennedy stood before the United States Congress and said something remarkably bold. He challenged the entire nation to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. Think about that for a moment. In 1961, nobody had any real idea how to do it. The technology barely existed. And yet, here was a president looking the world in the eye and saying, "We're going to the moon." It's a lovely thought to sit with, isn't it? That sometimes the biggest things start with nothing more than someone deciding they're possible. What followed was one of the largest peacetime efforts in human history. At its peak, the Apollo program employed around 400,000 people. 400,000. That's not just astronauts and rocket scientists. That's welders and seamstresses and electricians, people stitching spacesuits by hand, people testing tiny valves in quiet rooms, people writing lines of code on paper before typing them into machines that filled entire buildings. If you had walked through America in the mid-1960s and asked around, chances are you would have found someone or someone who knew someone working to get people to the moon. And over 20,000 contractors were involved across the country, all feeding into this one beautiful, enormous goal. There's something quite comforting about that, I think. The idea that so many people, most of whom would never meet each other, were all quietly doing their part, all pulling in the same direction, Now, a project like this didn't come cheap. By the time it was finished in 1973, the Apollo program had cost roughly $25.4 billion. In today's money, that's somewhere around 257 billion. Those are staggering numbers. But when you think about what was achieved, when you think about the fact that human beings actually walked on another world and came home again, it starts to feel like one of the better investments anyone ever made. Let's settle in a little deeper now. Get cozy. And let me tell you about one of the most important decisions in the whole program. One that most people have never heard of. In the early days, nobody could agree on how to actually get to the moon. There were 3 ideas on the table. The first was called direct ascent. This was the simplest concept. You build one enormous rocket, fly it straight to the moon, land the whole thing, and fly it back. The trouble was, the rocket you'd need would have been colossal, far bigger than anything ever built. They even had a name for it, the Nova rocket, but it existed only on paper. The second idea was called Earth Orbit Rendezvous. In this plan, you'd launch several smaller rockets, assemble a spacecraft in orbit around the Earth, and then head to the moon from there. Clever but complicated, lots of moving parts and lots of risk. The third idea, and this is the one that changed everything, was called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And the man behind it was an engineer named John Houbolt, who worked at the Langley Research Center. Houbolt's plan was elegant. Instead of landing the entire spacecraft on the moon, you'd carry a small, lightweight lander along for the ride. When you reached lunar orbit, the lander would detach, carry 2 astronauts down to the surface, and then fly back up to rejoin the main ship. The main spacecraft would never have to land at all. It was clever because it saved an extraordinary amount of weight. A lighter spacecraft meant a smaller rocket, which meant the whole thing was actually achievable within Kennedy's deadline. But here's the thing. Almost nobody wanted to listen to Houbolt at first. He was met with what was later described as direct hostility. Senior engineers, program managers, even Wernher von Braun himself, the legendary rocket designer, initially dismissed the idea. But Houbolt didn't give up. He kept pushing, and in November of 1961, he did something rather brave. He bypassed the entire chain of command and wrote a 9-page letter directly to one of NASA's most senior officials, a man named Robert Siemens. In that letter, Houbolt made his case passionately, and he asked a simple question: do we want to go to the moon or not? That question cut through everything. Slowly, the right people started listening. The maths was undeniable, and by July of 1962, NASA officially adopted Lunar Orbit Rendezvous as the mission plan. It's widely credited with saving billions of dollars and, more importantly, making the whole thing possible within the timeline. Isn't that a wonderful little story to fall asleep to? One person believing in something, writing a letter and changing the course of history. Now, once they knew how they were going to get there, they needed the machine to do it. And that machine was the Saturn V rocket. If you've ever seen pictures of it, you'll know it was breathtaking. It stood 363 feet tall. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty. It remains the largest and most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The first stage was powered by 5 F1 engines, and each one of those engines is the most powerful single-chamber rocket engine ever built. A single F1 produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. All 5 together consumed fuel at a rate that generated more power than 85 Hoover dams. That comparison always makes me smile. 85 Hoover dams just to get off the ground. The Saturn V was built in 3 stages, and each stage would burn through its fuel and then fall away, making the rocket lighter and lighter as it climbed higher and higher. By the time the spacecraft reached orbit, most of that giant rocket was already gone, tumbling back towards the ocean below. There's something almost poetic about that. You carry only what you need for the next part of the journey, and you let go of the rest. That's not bad advice for falling asleep either, come to think of it. Let go of what you don't need right now. The day is done. The only thing left is rest. So there we are. That's how it all began. A president's challenge, hundreds of thousands of people working together, one stubborn engineer with a letter and a dream, and a rocket so powerful it still holds the record more than 50 years later. Take a slow breath in for me, and a long, easy breath out. We've got plenty more to explore together. The moon is waiting for us, and there's no rush at all. Through fire and starlight. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. You're doing so well. Just listening, just breathing. The world outside can wait until morning. Right now, it's just you and the stars and a story worth hearing. Before anyone could walk on the moon, something terrible happened. Something that changed everything about how NASA thought about safety. And I want to tell you about it gently because even in the sad parts of this story, there is something deeply human and deeply moving. On January the 27th, 1967, 3 astronauts were inside their capsule at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. They were running a routine test on the launch pad, not a flight, just a rehearsal. Their names were Virgil Grissom, though everyone called him Gus, Edward White, who had been the first American to walk in space, and Roger Chaffee, a bright young pilot on his first mission. The capsule they were sitting in was filled with pure oxygen, which was the standard at the time. And somewhere in that tangle of wires and equipment, a spark caught.
In a pure oxygen environment, fire doesn't just burn, it erupts. The blaze spread so quickly that there was nothing anyone could do. All 3 men were lost.
It was a devastating moment. The whole program stopped, and in the silence that followed, NASA took a long, hard look at everything. The hatch was redesigned so it could be opened quickly from the inside. Fire-resistant materials replaced the ones that had failed. Wiring was overhauled. Safety procedures were rewritten from the ground up. The lessons of that day are woven into every spacecraft that has flown since. Gus, Ed, and Roger gave everything, and in doing so, they made the path safer for everyone who followed them. I think there's a kind of grace in that. Even in loss, something was carried forward. Let your shoulders relax now. Let your jaw soften. There's no tension you need to hold on to. After the redesign, NASA moved forward carefully. Several uncrewed test flights went up first, Apollo 4, 5, and 6, proving that the Saturn V rocket and the lunar module could do what they were supposed to do. And then, in October of 1968, astronauts finally returned to space aboard Apollo 7. It was an 11-day mission in Earth orbit, and its job was to test the redesigned command module. Everything worked. Confidence was coming back. But what happened next was one of the boldest decisions in the history of exploration. Apollo 8 was originally planned as another Earth orbit test, but intelligence suggested the Soviet Union might be preparing to send cosmonauts around the moon. NASA made a stunning call. They accelerated the schedule and decided that Apollo 8 would fly all the way to the moon, not to land, just to orbit. But still, this would be the first time any human being had ever left the neighborhood of the Earth and traveled to another world. On December the 21st, 1968, astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders climbed into their capsule and launched from Florida. 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, they arrived at the moon. They orbited it 10 times, 10 quiet loops around the far side and back again. And on one of those passes, as they came around the limb of the moon, William Anders looked out the window and saw something nobody had ever seen before: the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. He grabbed his camera and took a photograph. It's called Earthrise, and it's one of the most famous images ever captured. This small, blue, impossibly beautiful planet hanging in the blackness of space above the gray curve of the moon. It changed the way people thought about home, about how fragile and precious this little world of ours really is. That Christmas Eve, the crew read from the book of Genesis as they orbited the moon, broadcasting their words back to Earth. It's estimated that about a quarter of all the people alive at the time were listening. Imagine that. A quarter of every person on the planet, all pausing on Christmas Eve, all looking up. It gives me goosebumps even now. After Apollo 8 proved that the journey to the moon was survivable, 2 more missions followed to prepare for the landing. Apollo 9 stayed in Earth orbit, but tested the lunar module for the first time with astronauts aboard. They practiced undocking, flying separately, and then redocking, rehearsing every step of the delicate dance that would have to happen above the moon. It all went beautifully. Then came Apollo 10 in May of 1969. This was the full dress rehearsal. The crew flew all the way to the moon, entered lunar orbit, and then 2 of the astronauts took the lunar module down to within 50,000 feet of the surface. 50,000 feet. That's less than 10 miles. They could see the craters and the boulders and the dust below them. They could practically touch it. But they didn't land. That wasn't their job. Their job was to prove that every single piece of the puzzle worked. And it did. Every system, every procedure, every calculation. Apollo 10 came home and said, "It's ready. The next crew can go all the way down." Can you imagine being that close to the moon and having to turn around? There's a lovely bit of discipline in that. Knowing your role, trusting the plan, and letting the next person take the step you helped make possible. And just like that, the stage was set. In the summer of 1969, a rocket would stand on the launch pad in Florida, carrying 3 men toward a moment that would change the world forever. But that's a story for the next part of our evening. For now, just rest with what you've heard. Think about Earthrise if you like, that beautiful blue marble floating in the dark. Think about how quiet it must have been up there, orbiting the moon on Christmas Eve. The hum of the spacecraft, the soft crackle of the radio, the whole Earth fitting in the palm of your hand. Breathe in slowly and let it go. You're exactly where you need to be. One small step in the stillness. There we go. Settle back in. If you've shifted position, that's perfectly fine. Find your comfortable spot again. Let the pillow cradle you. We're about to walk on the moon together, and I promise you, it's going to be lovely. July the 20th, 1969. The date that changed everything. 3 astronauts had launched from Florida 4 days earlier aboard Apollo 11. Their names were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The journey to the moon took about 3 days, which was fairly typical for the Apollo missions. The moon sits roughly 238,000 miles away from us. That's an almost impossible number to picture, isn't it? But the Saturn V had done its job, and the spacecraft had crossed that vast, silent distance right on schedule. When they arrived in lunar orbit, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module. They'd named it Eagle. Collins stayed behind in the command module, orbiting above, alone. He would circle the moon over and over while his crewmates attempted something no one had ever done. Every time he passed behind the far side, he lost all radio contact with Earth. Complete silence, just him and the stars. He later said he didn't feel lonely. He felt awareness. I think that's rather beautiful. Now, the descent didn't go entirely to plan, and that's part of what makes it such a wonderful story. As the Eagle began its powered descent toward the surface, Armstrong noticed something concerning. He was looking out the window at the craters passing below, and he realized they were appearing about 2 seconds earlier than they should have been. 2 seconds might not sound like much, but at the speed they were traveling, it meant the Eagle was overshooting its landing site. They were heading long, drifting past their target in the sea of tranquility. Part of this was caused by the moon's uneven gravity. Beneath the large flat plains, there are hidden mass concentrations called mascons, dense regions of rock that create subtle gravitational tugs. These mascons pulled the spacecraft just a fraction off course. But there was another factor too, and it's one of those odd little details that I find quietly delightful. When the lunar module undocked from the command module, a tiny amount of air was left inside the connecting tunnel. That trapped air acted like a miniature thruster, giving the Eagle a small, unexpected push. Nobody had accounted for it, and it was just enough to nudge them further downrange. By the time Armstrong looked out and saw where they were heading, it was a field of boulders the size of cars surrounding a large crater. Not a good place to land, so he took manual control. Calmly, steadily, he flew the Eagle forward, skimming over the rough ground, searching for a clear spot. Fuel was running low. Mission Control called out the numbers. 60 seconds of fuel remaining, then 30. And then, gently, the Eagle touched down. A light on the instrument panel glowed blue. Armstrong's voice came through the static, calm as anything. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Back in Mission Control, the reply came with just a trace of emotion. "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." I love that moment. After all that tension, all that precision, the very human admission that everyone had been holding their breath. Let yourself breathe now too, nice and slow, in through the nose and out through the mouth. You're safe and warm, and the story is only getting better. A few hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch, climbed down the ladder, and stepped onto the surface of the moon. It was the 21st of July, 1969, at 2:56 in the morning, Universal Time. He became the first human being to stand on another world. His words drifted back across 238,000 miles of empty space. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin joined him shortly after. They spent their time on the surface collecting samples, about 20 kilograms of lunar rock and soil. They set up scientific instruments. They planted a flag. And then, after just a short while on the surface, they climbed back into the Eagle, lifted off, and rejoined Michael Collins in orbit. 12 people in total would walk on the moon across the entire Apollo program. 12. In all of human history, only 12 people have stood on another world and looked back at the Earth. That number still catches my breath a little, even now. Now, after Apollo 11 proved it could be done, the next mission set out to prove it could be done with precision. Apollo 12 launched in November of 1969. And this time the goal was to land at a very specific spot in a region called the Ocean of Storms. and not just roughly in the right area. They wanted to set down within walking distance of a robotic probe called Surveyor 3, which had landed on the moon 2.5 years earlier, all by itself, long before any astronauts arrived. Astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean flew the lunar module down and landed it within 160 meters of Surveyor 3. 160 meters on another world 238,000 miles from home. That is extraordinary accuracy. It proved that these landings could be targeted, that future missions could aim for specific scientific sites with confidence. Conrad and Bean walked over to the old Surveyor probe and carefully removed its camera. They brought it all the way back to Earth so scientists could examine it. They wanted to know what 2 years on the lunar surface had done to it, how the harsh environment of space, the radiation, the temperature swings, the micrometeorite impacts had affected the materials. It was like visiting an old friend who had been sitting quietly on the moon, waiting. And here's something lovely to drift off thinking about. When the astronauts walked on the surface, they experienced the moon's gravity firsthand. Gravity on the moon is just 1/6 of what we feel here on Earth. Your weight, the pull you feel holding you to the ground, drops dramatically. But your mass stays the same. You're still you, just lighter on your feet. The astronauts found that normal walking didn't really work. Instead, they developed a kind of loping, bouncing stride, almost like a slow motion skip. They could carry heavy equipment and bundles of rocks that would have been a real struggle on Earth, and it all felt manageable, even graceful. I like to picture that. Astronauts in bulky white suits, gently bouncing across a gray, sunlit plain with the black sky above them, and the Earth hanging like a lantern in the distance. No wind, no sound except their own breathing inside the helmet. Just stillness and the soft crunch of ancient dust beneath their boots. Speaking of that dust, here's one of my favorite little details from the whole program. When the astronauts came back inside the lunar module after their moonwalks, they noticed something unexpected. The lunar dust had a smell. It smelled like spent gunpowder. A sharp, almost burnt scent that caught in the nose immediately. Astronauts from several different missions all reported the same thing. But here's the curious part. When those same lunar samples were brought back to Earth and studied in laboratories, they had no smell at all. None. So what was happening? The answer is wonderfully strange. The surface of the moon is constantly bombarded by tiny meteorites and particles from the solar wind, traveling at extraordinary speeds. This bombardment breaks apart the minerals in the dust at a molecular level, leaving what scientists call dangling bonds, tiny unsatisfied connections on the surface of each grain. like hands reaching out with nothing to hold. On the moon, in the near-perfect vacuum, there's nothing for those bonds to grab onto. So the dust stays in this activated, reactive state for millions of years, just waiting. But the moment the astronauts brought it into the cabin, into warm, moist, oxygen-rich air, those dangling bonds reacted instantly. They grabbed onto the oxygen, onto the moisture. The result was a little cascade of chemistry that released those distinctive odors, and once the dust had been exposed to air for a few hours, the bonds settled down, paired off, and the smell vanished completely. So the moon smells like gunpowder, but only for a little while, only in that first brief meeting between ancient lunar dust and human air. I think there's something almost magical about that. A scent that exists only in the moment of contact and then is gone forever. Let that image rest softly in your mind now. The quiet of the lunar surface, the soft gray dust. A smell that lasts only long enough to be noticed and then fades like a whisper. You don't have to hold on to any of this. Just let it wash over you like a gentle tide. We'll keep going whenever you're ready, but there's no hurry at all. The moon has been waiting 4.5 billion years. It can wait a few more minutes for you. When things went quiet, let your body feel heavy now. Heavy in the best way, like you're sinking into something soft and safe. The kind of heaviness that comes right before sleep, when your arms and legs don't want to move anymore and your thoughts start to blur at the edges. That's a good feeling. Welcome it. We've talked about triumph, about that first step on the moon, about precision and wonder. But now I want to tell you about something different. A mission that never reached the lunar surface, and yet in many ways showed more about human courage and ingenuity than any landing ever could. April the 11th, 1970. Apollo 13 launched from Florida carrying astronauts James Lovell, Fred Hayes, and John Swigert. Their destination was a hilly region of the moon called Fra Mauro. Everything was going smoothly. The launch was clean, the trajectory was good, and the crew had settled into the quiet routine of the coast toward the moon. 56 hours into the flight, they were closer to the moon than to the Earth. And then, without warning, something broke. An oxygen tank in the service module exploded. Not a small malfunction, not a flickering warning light, a genuine explosion that ripped open the side of the spacecraft and sent vital oxygen venting into space. The crew watched through the window as a cloud of gas streamed out into the darkness. One of them radioed Houston with words that have become some of the most famous in the history of space travel. Houston, we've had a problem. Within minutes, it became clear that the mission to the moon was over. But survival was far from certain. The command module was losing power, losing oxygen, losing heat. The crew couldn't turn back the way they had come. They were already on a path that would swing them around the far side of the moon, and the quickest way home was to use the moon's gravity to slingshot them back toward Earth. That meant spending days in a crippled spacecraft, rationing every drop of water and every watt of power. Here's what they did, and it still amazes me. The crew moved out of the damaged command module and into the lunar module. The little lander that had been designed to carry 2 people to the surface of the moon for a day and a half became a lifeboat for 3 people over 4 days. It was never built for that. The air scrubbers weren't designed for 3 sets of lungs. The water supply was limited. The temperature dropped until it was barely above freezing, and condensation coated every surface. Back in Houston, Mission Control scrambled. Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team worked around the clock, improvising solutions to problems nobody had ever imagined. Engineers on the ground built makeshift air filters out of materials they knew were available on the spacecraft, things like cardboard, plastic bags, and tape, and then talked the crew through building them in real time. It was engineering at its most raw and beautiful. No simulations, no second chances, just people solving problems to keep other people alive. The crew swung around the far side of the moon in darkness. They could see the surface below them, gray and silent, tantalizingly close. But they couldn't stop. They had to keep going, riding the long curve back toward Earth. The journey home took days. The astronauts were exhausted, dehydrated, and freezing, but they held on. On April the 17th, the command module separated from the battered service module, re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. All 3 men survived. The mission became known as a successful failure because while it never reached the moon, it proved something perhaps even more important: that when everything goes wrong, people can still find a way through. I find that thought very comforting, actually, especially at night when worries sometimes feel bigger than they are. The idea that even in the most frightening moments, there are people working on solutions, people who care, people who won't give up. Now let's leave Apollo 13 resting safely in the ocean and turn to something rather different. Something that most people have never heard about, but that I find absolutely fascinating. The computer that guided every Apollo mission to the moon, it was called the Apollo Guidance Computer, and by today's standards, it was astonishingly simple. Your phone is millions of times more powerful, but in the 1960s, this machine was revolutionary. It was one of the very first computers to use integrated circuits, the tiny silicon chips that would eventually lead to everything from laptops to smartwatches. In fact, NASA's demand for these chips helped accelerate the growth of what would become Silicon Valley. So in a way, every time you tap a screen or send a message, there's a little thread that leads all the way back to the Apollo program. The computer had a 15-bit word length, which is a technical way of saying it worked with very small numbers. And it did its maths using something called one's complement arithmetic. Now, you don't need to understand the details, but there's a charming quirk I want to share with you. Because of the way one's complement works, the computer had two different versions of 0, a positive 0 and a negative 0. In modern computers, there's only one 0, but the Apollo computer could look at nothing and see it two different ways. I rather like that idea, two kinds of nothing. It's almost philosophical. The programmers had to be incredibly careful about this, because if the computer encountered the wrong type of 0 at the wrong time, it could get confused, looping endlessly or taking a wrong turn in its calculations. Every line of code had to account for this little oddity. It was like building a cathedral out of matchsticks, precise, painstaking, and beautiful in its own way. Here's another lovely detail. The computer did all its internal maths in metric units, meters and kilograms, the international standard. But the astronauts were military pilots, trained in feet and nautical miles. So the computer would think in metric, do all its calculations in metric, and then quietly convert everything to imperial units just for the display. The astronauts never knew the difference. This silent metric operation in the heart of an American spacecraft during the 1960s is one of those wonderful hidden facts that rarely gets mentioned. And then there were the alarms. During the Apollo 11 landing, just as Armstrong and Aldrin were descending toward the surface, the computer started flashing warning codes. 1202, 1201. In mission control, hearts stopped. Nobody was entirely sure what those codes meant in real time. The codes indicated that the computer was being overloaded. Too many tasks were being asked of it at once. To the computer. These signals arrived as to the computer. These signals arrived as constant interruptions, little electronic taps on the shoulder that the computer had to respond to. Each one consumed processing power. And when you added that to the landing radar, the navigation equations, and the engine control, the computer's tiny brain was simply being asked to do too much. Flushed out all the low priority tasks. Flushed out all the low priority tasks. Things like updating the display, and kept only the critical ones running, the ones that controlled the engine and tracked the trajectory. The display might flicker, but the spacecraft kept flying straight and true. Is demanding your attention. Focus on what matters most. There's something quite wise in that, don't you think? When everything is demanding your attention, focus on what truly matters and let the rest go. The moon landing was saved not by perfection, but by a machine that knew how to prioritize under pressure. And while we're talking about strange and wonderful things, let me tell you what happens when something heavy crashes into the moon. During the Apollo missions, NASA deliberately crashed spent rocket stages and lunar module gradual ascent stages into the surface so that seismometers left behind by the astronauts could record the vibrations. And what they recorded was truly extraordinary. When the Apollo 13 rocket stage hit the moon, the ground vibrated for over 55 minutes. On Earth, a similar impact would produce vibrations lasting just a few minutes. But the moon rang like a bell for nearly an hour. Now, this isn't because the moon is hollow. That's a popular myth, but it's not true. The real explanation is far more interesting. The moon is extraordinarily dry. Deep inside, there's almost no water at all, no moisture trapped in the rock. On Earth, even tiny amounts of water in the ground act as a kind of shock absorber, dampening seismic waves. The moon has none of that. So when a wave starts traveling through the lunar interior, there's almost nothing to stop it. It just keeps going, bouncing and echoing, slowly fading, but taking its time about it. On top of that, the outer layer of the moon is made up of something called the megaregolith, a deep blanket of shattered, fragmented rock that extends down over a kilometer in places. This layer scatters the seismic waves in every direction, trapping the energy in a kind of slow, diffusing haze. The waves bounce between fragments millions of times like light bouncing around inside a cloud. So you end up with this combination that doesn't exist anywhere on Earth. Extremely low energy loss and extremely high scattering. The result is a world that hums and shivers for nearly an hour after a single impact. A world that holds onto vibrations the way a tuning fork holds onto a note. I think that's a beautiful image to carry with you as you drift off. The moon, still and silver in the sky above your window, quietly ringing with ancient echoes, holding on to sounds from impacts that happened billions of years ago, the same way it holds the footprints of 12 astronauts in its dust, undisturbed, unchanged. Let your mind go soft now, let it blur. There's more to come, but it will be here when you're ready. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're starting to drift, even better. Either way, I'm right here. By the way, if you ever find that sleep is something you really struggle with, we sometimes pop a few helpful bits and pieces into the description below this video. Things like products we've come across or little resources that might help. Nothing pushy, just things we thought were worth sharing. Have a look whenever you like. No rush at all. Roving beneath a black sky. We're deep into the night now, you and I, and deep into the story too. If your eyes are closed, that's wonderful. If you're still watching, that's fine too. Just let your breathing be slow and easy, in and out like a gentle tide. The early Apollo landings had proven that human beings could travel to the moon, walk on it, and come home safely. But as the program went on, the missions began to change. The focus shifted from simply getting there to something quieter and, in many ways, more wonderful. Science. Real, careful, patient science. The kind that asks questions about where we come from and what the universe is made of. Apollo 14 launched in January of 1971 and finally completed the journey that Apollo 13 had been unable to make. The crew landed at Fra Mauro, that hilly region the earlier mission had been aiming for. Astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell explored the surface, collecting 46 kilograms of rock and soil. That's over 100 pounds of another world, gathered by hand and carried home. Shepard, by the way, was a remarkable figure. He had been the first American in space a decade earlier, back in 1961, aboard a tiny Mercury capsule. And now here he was, 10 years later, walking on the moon. He was the oldest astronaut to make the trip at that point, and there's a wonderful sense of persistence in that, of someone who loved exploration so deeply that a decade of waiting only made the experience more meaningful. Apollo 14 also brought along the first wheeled transport vehicle used on the moon. It was a small, hand-pulled cart, not yet the famous rover, but it was a start. A way of carrying more equipment and more samples further from the landing site. Every mission was reaching a little further, learning a little more. But the real transformation came with Apollo 15 in July of 1971. This was the first of what NASA called the J-class missions, designed for extended stays and much more ambitious science. And it brought something that changed everything about how astronauts explored the lunar surface. The Lunar Roving Vehicle. Picture this for me. A lightweight open-topped car about 10 feet long with wire mesh wheels and a little antenna on the front. It was battery-powered, built to fold up and fit into a compartment on the side of the lunar module, and it could carry 2 astronauts and all their equipment across the gray, rolling landscape of the moon. It had no roof, no windshield, just 2 seats side by side, under a black sky full of stars that never twinkled. Astronauts David Scott and James Irwin were the first to drive it, and they explored the Hadley Apennine region, a dramatic landscape of deep channels and towering mountains. Over the course of their stay, they drove nearly 28 kilometers across the surface. 28 kilometers on the moon. I want you to imagine that for a moment. 2 people in white suits driving a little electric car across an ancient, silent world, with the earth hanging above the horizon like a blue and white marble. No sound except their own voices and the soft hum of the motor. Dust lifting gently from the wheels and falling straight back down because there's no air to carry it sideways, just straight up and straight back down in perfect slow arcs. It must have been extraordinary, and during those drives they found something that took everyone's breath away. A rock that scientists would later call the Genesis Rock. It was a piece of anorthosite, a pale, crystalline mineral, and when they got it back to Earth and tested it, they discovered it was over 4 billion years old. 4 billion. That's nearly as old as the moon itself. this little rock had been sitting on the surface undisturbed for almost the entire history of the solar system. No weather to erode it, no water to wash it away, no plants to grow over it. Just silence and starlight for 4,000 million years until two human beings drove up in a little car and picked it up. There's something very tender about that, I think. The idea of reaching out and holding something so ancient, feeling the weight of 4 billion years in the palm of your hand. The scientific instruments left behind by the Apollo missions deserve a quiet moment of appreciation too. Each landing mission deployed what was called an ALSEP package, which stands for Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package. These were collections of sensors and transmitters that the astronauts set up on the surface before leaving, seismometers to listen for moonquakes, instruments to measure the solar wind, detectors to study the thin wisps of gas that pass for a lunar atmosphere, heat probes pushed into the ground to measure the temperature below the surface. And here's the part I find quietly amazing. After the astronauts left, after the lunar modules lifted off and the crews headed home, those little packages stayed behind, sitting on the surface in the silence. And they kept working. They kept sending data back to Earth year after year. Long after the last astronaut had gone, they transmitted faithfully until 1977, when NASA finally switched them off. 6 years after some of them were placed there, still whispering their findings across 238,000 miles of space. I like to think of them out there, even now, dark and quiet on the surface, their work done, resting. Let your hands relax. Let your fingers uncurl. There's nothing you need to hold on to. Apollo 16 arrived in April of 1972 and explored a region called the Descartes Highlands. Scientists on Earth had believed this area was volcanic, shaped by ancient lava flows. But when astronauts John Young and Charles Duke examined the rocks up close and brought samples home, the truth turned out to be different. The highlands weren't volcanic at all. They had been formed by impacts, enormous collisions from the early days of the solar system that shattered and reformed the crust. It was a reminder that even our best theories sometimes need to be rewritten, that the universe has a habit of surprising us when we finally get close enough to look properly. And then came the final mission, December 1972, Apollo 17. The last time human beings would travel to the moon. This mission was special for many reasons, but one stands out above the rest. One of the astronauts, Harrison Schmitt, was not a military pilot. He was a geologist, a scientist with a PhD, trained to read rocks the way a musician reads sheet music. He was the only professional scientist to ever walk on the moon, and his presence made an enormous difference. Schmitt and his crewmate Eugene Cernan explored the Taurus Littrow Valley, a deep, narrow region surrounded by towering mountains. They drove the rover further than anyone had before, traveling 7.6 kilometers from the lunar module at their furthest point. They spent 75 hours on the surface, the longest stay of any Apollo crew. And they collected 110 kilograms of samples, more than any other mission. Every moment was used. Every hour counted. And then Harrison Schmitt found something that nobody expected. He was walking near a small crater called Shorty when he looked down and noticed something odd about the ground. The soil was orange, not gray, not brown. Orange, bright, vivid, unmistakable orange, sitting right there on the surface of the moon. He called out to Kernan. He could barely contain his excitement. This was completely unexpected. When the samples were brought back to Earth and analyzed, scientists discovered that the orange soil was made of tiny glass beads, formed by ancient volcanic eruptions billions of years ago. Fountains of lava had sprayed molten rock into the vacuum of space, where it cooled instantly into these perfect little spheres, colored by their iron and titanium content. They were evidence of a volcanic past far more dramatic and complex than anyone had imagined. Proof that the moon had once been a world of fire and motion, even though it now sits so still and quiet above us. Those tiny orange beads are still being studied today. In fact, as recently as 2025, scientists using powerful electron microscopes have found even more secrets inside them. Miniature crystals of a mineral called sphalerite, a compound of zinc and sulfur, so small they can only be seen at extreme magnification. These crystals formed inside volcanic plumes, deposited by hot gases as the eruption cooled. They tell us that the volcanic processes on the ancient moon involved complex mixtures of gases, including carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and sulfur. Far richer and more varied than scientists once believed. Little time capsules, 3.5 billion years old, still giving up their secrets to anyone patient enough to look. Eventually, the time came to leave. Eugene Cernan was the last to climb the ladder back into the lunar module. Before he did, he paused. He stood on the surface of the moon for the final time and spoke a few words. He said that he was leaving as he had come, with faith and hope for all mankind. And then he stepped off the surface, and no human being has stood there since. That was December the 14th, 1972, more than 50 years ago now. The footprints Kernan left are still there, exactly as he made them. No wind to fill them, no rain to wash them smooth. Just the quiet preservation of a world without weather, holding on to those marks the way it holds on to everything, patiently, gently, for as long as the moon endures. Across all 6 successful landings, the astronauts brought home a total of 382 kilograms of lunar rock and soil. That's 842 pounds of the moon carried home to Earth in carefully sealed containers. And those samples are still being studied, still revealing new things. New generations of scientists with new instruments are finding answers to questions that hadn't even been thought of when the rocks were collected. Think about that as you lie here, somewhere, right now, in a quiet laboratory. Someone is carefully examining a piece of the moon that was picked up by an astronaut more than 50 years ago. And they're learning something new. The story is still being told. Let your thoughts drift now. Let them float like those tiny glass beads, weightless and colorful, spinning slowly in the dark. There's no need to hold them in place. Just let them go wherever they want. A gentle goodbye. Well, here we are. We've come such a long way together tonight. From a president's challenge in 1961, through fire and loss, across 238,000 miles of silent space, all the way to the surface of the moon and back again. We've met stubborn engineers who wrote letters that changed history. We've watched a tiny computer with 2 kinds of zero save a lunar landing. We've held a rock 4 billion years old and smelled gunpowder that vanished in a breath. We've driven a little electric car across a valley surrounded by mountains no human will visit again for a long while yet. And we've seen the Earth rise above the moon on Christmas Eve, small and blue and impossibly precious. 12 people walked on the moon, just 12. And the last of them climbed back into his spacecraft on a December night in 1972, leaving footprints that are still there, perfect and undisturbed, waiting quietly in the dust. Those missions gave us so much more than moon rocks. The technology that came from Apollo found its way into everyday life in ways most people never realize. Fire-resistant clothing that now protects firefighters came from the redesigns after the Apollo 1 tragedy. Cordless power tools began with a drill that NASA and Black and Decker built together to collect lunar core samples. The camera sensor in your phone can trace its origins back to miniature cameras developed for spacecraft. Even the fly-by-wire systems in modern cars and aeroplanes grew from the electronic controls that guided those capsules through space. And perhaps the most lasting gift of all was cooperation. The very last flight to use Apollo hardware wasn't a moon mission at all. It was the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, a joint mission between the United States and the Soviet Union. 2 nations that had spent years racing against each other finally reached out and docked their spacecraft together in orbit. The technology developed for that handshake in space became the foundation for the International Space Station, where astronauts from all over the world live and work together to this day. From competition to cooperation, from rivalry to partnership. That might be the most beautiful thing the Apollo program left behind. Now the moon is still up there tonight. Maybe you can see it from your window, maybe not, but it's there all the same. drifting quietly through the sky, carrying its ancient secrets and its 12 sets of footprints and its little silent science packages that finished their work long ago. And you're here, warm and safe, with nothing left to do but rest. You've been wonderful company tonight. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wash over you. Let your mind wander, wash over you. Let your mind wander wherever it wants to go. Back to the moon if it likes, or somewhere else entirely. Somewhere only you know about. The music is there to keep you company for as long as you need it. Sleep well, sweet dreamer. And next time you look up at the moon, maybe you'll think of a little rover driving across a silent valley, or a pair of boots leaving prints in ancient dust, or the earth rising over a gray horizon like the most beautiful thing anyone has ever seen.